Marine General laughed at her weapon. Her next shot hit a target no sniper had ever reached. The rifle arrived at Fort Benning on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987. Crated in pine boards stained with motor oil and packed in shredded newsprint from a plant in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It weighed 14 pounds, 6 ounces. The barrel was 26 inches long. The stock was birch, not walnut, and it had been finished with 2 coats of linseed oil that hadn't fully dried. Staff Sergeant Ruth Calvert signed for it in the receiving bay at 0740 hours, alone, while the duty clerk watched from inside the warm office. The clerk didn't offer to help carry it. Didn't say anything. Ruth was 31 years old, had been assigned to the Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning for 3 years, working under Master Sergeant Dale Pruitt in the Experimental Weapons Section. Before that, she'd spent 4 years with the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg, qualifying expert on every rifle course she'd ever fired. 19 qualifications. 19 expert scores, the Army's top marksmanship designation, all 19 times. She had never once mentioned those numbers to anyone at the Marksmanship Unit. Pruitt had looked them up himself when she transferred in. The weapon she'd signed for had been built by a gunsmith named Arlen Voss in a workshop behind his house outside Cullman, Alabama. Voss was 67 years old. Had been building precision rifles since 1952. He'd never worked a government contract. Never wanted one. Ruth had found him through a gunsmith in Anniston who described Voss as the man who understood what bullets did through air better than anyone in the state. Maybe anywhere. She'd driven out to Cullman on a Saturday in October 1986, 2 hours each way, and spent 4 hours in the workshop listening to Voss explain why the rifle he was building could do something no standard-issue platform could. The workshop smelled of cutting oil and wood shavings and the particular metallic sharpness of freshly machined steel. She'd paid him $2,200 out of her own pocket, told no one. The target distance she was trying to reach was 2,400 meters. 1.5 miles, roughly. The Army's existing long-range sniper systems were designed for effective engagements out to 1,800 meters. That was the record that stood. The barrier no one had crossed in a documented, witnessed, controlled test environment. Ruth had been calculating the physics of crossing it for 14 months, filling the back pages of ranged notebooks with ballistic tables and atmospheric correction charts she derived by hand. She loaded the crate into the back of a borrowed Ford F-250 and drove it to the range facility herself. The problem with the existing platforms wasn't the cartridge. It wasn't the optics. The problem was everything that happened between the muzzle and the target across that distance. The bullet traveled for approximately 3 seconds at 2,400 meters. 3 seconds of exposure to wind variation, air density gradients, and the slow arc of gravity pulling the projectile downward. At 1,900 meters, an experienced shooter could account for those variables. At 2,400 meters, the accumulation of small errors across distance became something else. Each variable compounded the next. The rifle had to be consistent enough that its errors were smaller than the shooter's corrections. Voss had built the rifle to be exactly that. The action body had been machined from solid 4140 chrome moly steel. The bolt lugs had been lapped to a contact area of 92%, meaning nearly the full surface of both lugs met the corresponding surfaces in the receiver at the moment of lockup. Standard factory rifles ran 40 to 60% contact. The difference mattered when a cartridge fired at 63,000 pounds per square inch of chamber pressure. More contact meant more consistency in how the action returned to battery. More consistency meant smaller groups at distance. The mathematics were not complicated. The execution was. Voss had spent 6 weeks on the action alone. 3 weeks after the rifle arrived, Ruth put in a formal request to use the long-range test bay at Llano Range for a series of evaluation trials. The request went up the chain to Brigadier General Thomas Wickfield, who oversaw weapons evaluation for the infantry school. Wickfield called Dale Pruitt the morning he reviewed the paper, asked what Staff Sergeant Calvert thought she was trying to accomplish. Pruitt told him the distance. Wickfield asked him to repeat that. Pruitt did. Wickfield said he'd read the request again and get back to them. He got back to them 5 days later, approved the range time, scheduled it for April 11th. The rifle did not look like a precision instrument. That was the first thing people said when they saw it. The stock had been shaped with hand tools, not CNC machinery, and the wood showed the slight asymmetries that came from that process. The action body showed file marks near the locking lugs where Voss had fitted it by hand to within tolerances of 4/10,000ths of an inch. The bipod was a modified Harris unit Voss had machined down and rebalanced, so the cant was 0 under load. The optic mounting rail had been drilled and tapped into the receiver by hand, aligned with a bore sighting jig Voss had built in 1971 and used on every rifle since. The whole assembly looked like something built in a man's garage. It had been. Ruth spent the 3 weeks before the April evaluation at the range. Not at Llano, at the 1,000-meter facility on the north end of the post, in the early morning before the standard training iterations began. She was there at 0530 on most days. Left at 0800. Fired an average of 40 rounds per session. The ammunition she was using had been hand-loaded by Voss specifically for this rifle. A 1,338 caliber cartridge with a 300-grain Sierra Match King bullet, loaded to 850 feet per second muzzle velocity. The brass was Norma. Primers were Federal 215 large rifle Magnum. Powder charge precisely measured to within 1/10 of a grain per round. Voss had assembled 600 rounds, each one identical, within tolerances he'd established over 35 years of building competition-grade ammunition. Ruth tracked every shot, distance, wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, elevation, scope adjustment, point of impact relative to point of aim. She filled 2 notebooks in 3 weeks. Other shooters at the 1,000-meter facility noticed her pattern, the early hours, the careful note-taking, the consistency of position. Nobody asked what she was working toward. At the marksmanship unit, you didn't ask. You watched how someone shot, and you drew your own conclusions. On the morning of April 11th, the temperature at Llano Range was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest at 6 miles per hour, gusting to 11. The range was configured from the firing position to a steel plate target at 2,400 meters. The steel was 36 inches by 36 inches, a 3-foot square of half-inch AR-500 plate mounted on a steel frame at ground level. At that distance, it was not visible to the naked eye. Through a 20 power spotting scope, it appeared as a pale rectangle in the winter grass. Brigadier General Wickfield arrived at the range at 0900. He had 2 other officers with him, a colonel from the infantry school and a major from the research office. Dale Pruitt was there, 2 range safety officers, a photographer from the Army's documentation unit. 8 people total standing on the firing line in the cold morning air while Ruth set up. Wickfield looked at the rifle for a long time, walked a slow circle around it, looked at the stock and said nothing, looked at the barrel, picked up the bipod and set it back down, asked Ruth who had manufactured the optic. She told him it was a Schmidt & Bender 5 to 25 power scope with a mil-dot reticle and an elevation turret she and Voss had calibrated specifically for this cartridge at this muzzle velocity out to 2,600 meters. The calibration had taken 2 full days at a private range in Tennessee in December. Wickfield looked at the optic, looked at the action, set the rifle back on the sandbag rest. He told her the target was a waste of range time at that distance. Said it plainly, without particular heat. The way a man says something he considers established fact. He said, no rifle built outside of a controlled manufacturing environment could hold consistent mechanical accuracy at 2,400 meters. Said the ballistic variables at that range exceeded the compensation capability of a manually adjusted optic system. Said the hand-loaded ammunition, however carefully assembled, could not maintain the velocity consistency required to produce hits on a 36-inch plate. 3 separate problems, he explained. Any one of them would prevent what she was attempting. All 3 together made it not worth documenting. Ruth thanked him for his time, asked if she could proceed. He said she could. Told the colonel they'd observe for 30 minutes, and then return to the main building. Ruth lay down behind the rifle. She'd been in this position 840 times in the past 3 weeks. She knew where her left cheek met the comb of the stock, knew the weight of her support hand against the forend, knew the feel of the trigger at its precise break point, which Voss had set to 2 pounds, 4 ounces. She took 4 minutes to dial her wind correction, checked her data card. The firing point elevation was 236 feet. Temperature correction applied. She made 1 final turret adjustment. 1 click. She fired her first shot at 0923. The spotting team at the target position, 3 men with a 40-power Kowa scope set on a tripod in a shallow hide 100 meters behind the target, called miss. Left, approximately 24 inches. Ruth made a correction, 1/2 mil radian right on the windage turret. She fired again at 0925. The spotting team called a hit. She fired 5 more rounds over the next 9 minutes. The spotting team called 5 more hits. 6 hits out of 7 rounds at 2,400 meters. The 1 miss, the first shot, had served its purpose. The correction it provided gave her the windage. Each subsequent round had impacted the plate. Wickfield was still there at the end of the 9th minute. He hadn't left for the main building. He was standing behind the firing line with his arms crossed, looking through a 20 power spotting scope of his own. He didn't say anything when the 6th hit was called. Stayed another 5 minutes while Ruth fired 2 additional rounds. Both hit. 8 hits from 9 rounds total. The colonel from the infantry school said something to him quietly. Wickfield didn't respond. Ruth sat up from the rifle, checked the bore with a chamber flag, set the rifle on the sandbag, wrote in her notebook. Temperature had risen to 47 degrees by then. Wind had shifted slightly, moving to a west-northwest bearing. She noted both. Wickfield walked over to her. He looked at the rifle again, asked about the barrel specification. She told him it was a Krieger Barrels cut-rifled blank, 1 in 10 twist rate, 26 inches, hand-lapped by Voss over approximately 40 hours to remove tool marks and standardize bore dimensions across the full length. Wickfield wrote something in his own notebook. Asked about the action. She told him Voss had trued the bolt face and squared the receiver face to within 0.005 of an inch, both operations done with a Bridgeport milling machine he'd owned since 1964. Wickfield wrote that down too. Asked about the bedding. She described the pillar-bedded fiberglass liner Voss had installed inside the birch stock to eliminate pressure point shifts between the wood and the barrel. He asked no further questions about why she believed this was possible. He'd seen that it was. He didn't acknowledge what he'd said before the shooting began, didn't reference it. He asked if she would fire again. She fired 12 more rounds that afternoon. 11 hit the plate. The wind had increased by then, a 13-mile-per-hour gust crossing the range from the northwest at 13:45 hours, causing one round to push left by approximately 18 inches. The other 11 rounds hit within an 8-inch vertical spread on the plate, documented by the spotting team's impact marks. The formal documentation that came out of April 11th listed the engagement as the first verified accurate fire on a 36-inch square target at 2,400 meters from a manually constructed rifle system using hand-loaded ammunition under standard field conditions. The previous documented record for that target size in controlled testing had stood at 2,050 meters, set in 1983 by a team using a factory-built Macmillan TAC-50 with factory ammunition. This engagement exceeded that distance by 350 meters. The documentation went to the Infantry School Weapons Section. From there to the Marksmanship Unit Directorate. It took 6 weeks to move through channels. In June, a 2-page summary reached the office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. A copy went to the Marksmanship Unit's funding office. Another went to a defense contractor in Falls Church, Virginia, that was 3 years into a government contract for next-generation long-range rifle system development. Dale Pruitt called Ruth into his office on June 19th. He had the summary on his desk. He told her the Weapons Evaluation Board was requesting a follow-on trial. Formal conditions. Full instrumentation. Multiple firing positions. Multiple distances, from 1,800 meters out to 2,600. They wanted to see the full capability envelope. The board would include representatives from the infantry school, the marksmanship unit, and at least one outside evaluator. The follow-on trial was scheduled for September 9th at Yano Range. Ruth drove to Cullman the following week and told Voss what had happened. He listened without interrupting. Asked 2 questions. First, what the environmental conditions had been. Second, whether the action had been cleaned between the April session and now. She answered both. He made notes on a yellow legal pad. Said he wanted to look at the barrel at 500 rounds and check for throat erosion. Said he also wanted to revisit the stock bedding, because birch moved differently than he'd expected through the temperature change from December to April. Ruth and Voss worked through the summer. She drove to Cullman 4 times between June and August, spending 2 days each visit. The workshop stayed cool from a window unit Voss had bolted to the frame above his workbench in 1979. On each visit, she brought the rifle, her notebooks, and the fired brass from the intervening weeks of practice. Voss examined everything. The first major adjustment was to the barrel bedding. The birch stock had developed a slight contact point variance where the barrel met the stock channel during the temperature changes from December to April to June. Voss rebedded the barrel using Devcon metallic epoxy, creating a true free float condition from the receiver ring to the muzzle. The contact point variance disappeared. The second adjustment was to the trigger mechanism. Voss reduced the break weight from 2 pounds, 4 ounces to 1 pound, 14 ounces, and reduced the reset distance by 0.8 millimeters by shimming the sear spring with a piece of shim stock he cut from a coffee can lid. Ruth fired 200 rounds during the July visit to verify the changes. The groups tightened. At 1,000 meters, the average 5-shot group went from 3.1 inches to 2.4 inches, 7/10 of an inch. At 2,400 meters, those 7/10 translated to a meaningful reduction in near-miss probability. The ammunition for September was assembled to tighter tolerances than April. Voss weighed each powder charge to within 1/20th of a grain instead of 1/10. He sorted the brass by weight to within 1/10 of a grain per case, discarding 23 cases that fell outside the accepted range. He measured each bullet's seating depth to within 5/1000ths of an inch using a comparator he'd made in 1978. He assembled 800 rounds. The process took him 11 days. He did not charge Ruth for the additional time. She tried. He told her the April data had already paid for it. Ruth was at the range every morning in August. She added a 1,500-meter station to her training program, something Yano didn't have permanently configured. She arranged for a steel plate at that distance to be installed by the range crew on a temporary basis. They set it up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She was there both days each week from 0530 to 0830, firing from 3 different shooting positions across a total of 340 rounds through the month. She filled 3 more notebooks. September 9th came in clear and dry. Temperature at 0600 was 38 degrees. Wind at 4 miles per hour from the northwest. By 0900, the temperature had risen to 52 degrees, and the wind had increased to 9 miles per hour, consistent from the northwest with minor variation. Ruth had checked the forecast at 0400. The conditions were close to what she'd planned for. The Weapons Evaluation Board sent 7 people. 2 were from the marksmanship unit. 3 were from the infantry school. 1 was a civilian contractor from a defense research firm in McLean, Virginia, a man named Gerald Orth, who spent the first hour of the morning walking the range and checking wind flags with a handheld anemometer, making notes on a clipboard that was already half full by the time the shooting began. The 7th member of the board was Brigadier General Thomas Wickfield. Ruth fired at 8,100 meters first. 12 rounds. 11 hits. Gerald Orth wrote on his clipboard for 2 minutes after each shot was called. She moved to 2,000 meters. 12 rounds. 10 hits. She moved to 2,200 meters. 12 rounds. 9 hits. At 2,400 meters, she fired 15 rounds. 12 hits. The 3 misses came on rounds 4, 9, and 14, each during brief wind gusts that she tracked but underestimated by a small margin. At 2,600 meters, she fired 12 rounds, 7 hits. The 2,600-meter shots took her into terrain no documented test had mapped before. No formal record existed for accurate fire on a 36-inch target at that distance from any production or custom rifle system under field conditions. The first 4 rounds were misses used to walk into the target. Once she confirmed an impact on round 5, she made a single half-click correction and fired the remaining 7 rounds. 5 more hit. 7 total out of 12, at a distance where the bullet was in flight for approximately 3.4 seconds and had dropped from its muzzle trajectory by more than 800 inches. Wickfield stayed the full day. He fired no shots himself. Asked 4 questions during the break between distances. After the final string at 2,600 meters, he spoke with Ruth for 22 minutes beside the firing line. She answered everything he asked. He wrote 6 pages of notes. When he was finished, he shook her hand. Said the documentation would be thorough. It was. The formal report from September 9th ran to 47 pages. It covered the rifle specifications, ammunition specifications, atmospheric conditions at each firing string, shot-by-shot documentation, and comparative analysis against every publicly documented long-range precision fire record on file with the Army Marksmanship Unit. The conclusion section was 3 paragraphs. The first established the new verified record. The second noted the system had been developed at no cost to the government. The third recommended further evaluation of the techniques and specifications employed. The rifle was not procured as a standard system. That had never been the point, and Ruth had never believed it would be. The Army's procurement process required years of institutional review, manufacturing contracts, and production capacity that a single gunsmith in Cullman, Alabama could not provide. Arlen Voss had no interest in that process. He was 68 years old by September 1987, and had 14 rifles on his waiting list, each a private commission at his own pace and his own price. He kept building the way he'd always built, one at a time, taking as long as it took. What the September 9th trial did change was more permanent than a procurement contract. The data went into the Marksmanship Unit's research library. It became a reference baseline. When the Army began developing what would eventually become the M107 platform in the late 1980s, and when commercial manufacturers submitted long-range precision designs through the 1990s, the September 1987 Yano range data was there in that library as the numbers someone had already reached with a birch-stocked rifle and hand-loaded ammunition from a garage workshop in North Alabama. The baseline had moved. Everyone working past it had to account for that. Gerald Orth, the civilian contractor from McLean, cited the September 9th data in 3 separate technical reports over the following 4 years. The reports went to the office that managed the long-range rifle development contract. They changed some specifications in that contract. Orth never met Ruth again after that September morning. He cited the data without naming the shooter. That was standard practice. Ruth Calvert was promoted to Sergeant First Class in January 1988. She stayed with the Marksmanship Unit until 1994, running long-range training programs and developing curriculum that incorporated the lessons from the Voss Rifle Commission. She submitted 4 additional weapons evaluation proposals during those 6 years. 3 were approved and tested. 2 produced significant data. 1 changed the unit's training protocol for teaching wind reading at extended distances. She retired from the Army in 1999 at the rank of Master Sergeant, drove down to Cullman the following spring, and spent 3 days with Arlen Voss going over what the 12 years since September 1987 had produced. Voss showed her the 2 rifles he'd built incorporating lessons from that commission. Both were on heavier long-range platforms. Both were in the hands of competitive shooters who were using them on 1,000-meter targets at national matches in Camp Perry, Ohio. Neither rifle looked like a precision instrument to someone who didn't know what to look for. Both were. Voss died in 2003 at age 83. His son Robert kept the workshop, kept the tools, kept the Bridgeport mill from 1964, which still worked, kept the rifle on the wall above the workbench, where Arlen had hung it in 1988 after the September evaluation was complete. Ruth had offered to take it. Arlen had declined, said it belonged where it was built. Robert still builds rifles in that workshop, not to his father's volume. He takes commissions twice a year, 6 rifles total, and turns down the rest. He sometimes shows clients the rifle on the wall and tells them where it shot and what it hit. He tells them the distance. They ask him to say it again. The documentation from September 9, 1987 is still in the Army Marksmanship Unit's reference library at Fort Benning. The rifle is still in Cullman, still on that wall, still in the workshop where it was made. Built right the first time.